The Rebel Alliance, Exploring the Fleet. Chapter 1. The Birth of a Fleet. In the vast silence of the galaxy, where the stars served as mute witnesses to the slow death of liberty, the seeds of rebellion began not with fanfare or fleets, but with whispers, couriers, and quiet coordination. The Rebel Alliance's fleet, later known as one of the most pivotal forces to ever oppose the Galactic Empire, did not emerge from mighty shipyards or sanctioned command structures. Instead, it was born in shadows, assembled from the scraps of forgotten wars, the goodwill of dissenters, and the ingenuity of those with little else to give but their defiance. The naval doctrine of the rebellion was forged from necessity and desperation. With the Empire's might stretching from the core worlds to the outer rim, the Alliance could not match it in a traditional stand-up war. The lessons of the Clone Wars had been internalized by Imperial tacticians: vast numbers, brutal force, and overwhelming control. For the Rebel fleet, survival depended on fluidity, adaptability, and the ability to strike like a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer. At its conception, the Rebel Alliance was not a monolithic entity, but a loose web of resistant cells, political dissidents, and military defectors scattered across the galaxy. Some groups, like the Free Ryloth movement or the insurgents of Onderon, operated independently with limited contact between them. Others, such as the partisans under Saw Gerrera, rejected any notion of coordinated effort, preferring scorched earth tactics that would later see them cast out from the emerging alliance structure. Still, a few visionaries foresaw the need for a unified front. Among these were Senator Mon Mothma of Chandrila, Bel Organa of Alderaan, and the warrior statesman Admiral Raddus of Mon Cala. These figures would become instrumental in taking scattered cells and isolated firebrands and turning them into something resembling a coherent naval force. Before these efforts bore fruit, however, the early days were defined by improvisation. Lacking access to military shipyards or legal procurement channels, the rebellion turned to whatever could be salvaged, stolen, or converted. Ancient Corellian freighters, Clone Wars-era surplus, and smuggler ships made up the earliest fleets. YT-1000, 300S with hidden weapon mounts. Action 6. Transports repurposed for troop deployment. Civilian transports reinforced with hull plating scavenged from derelicts. These ships were not built for combat, but for survival. The few heavy weapons they possessed were usually bolted on in haste, manned by volunteers with little training and deployed with only the vaguest tactical oversight. It was a time of jury-rigging and last-ditch solutions, and in the hearts of those who crewed these ships, the understanding was clear. They were not expected to win. They were expected to make a statement. Into this chaotic environment stepped Mon Mothma, a senator who had risked everything by publicly denouncing Emperor Palpatine following the Goman massacre. Her actions severed any last ties between diplomacy and resistance. Bail Organa, ever the clandestine operator, used his resources on Alderaan to support the rebellion in secret, funneling supplies, coordinating intelligence networks, and helping to shelter Jedi survivors and other fugitives. While Mothma provided the ideological backbone and Organa the logistical arteries, it was Admiral Raddus who brought naval discipline and strategic coherence. A war veteran of Mon Cala, Raddus was one of the few commanders who had not only fought during the Clone Wars, but had also studied the weaknesses of Imperial naval doctrine. It was under his influence that the Mon Calamari began secretly retrofitting their massive city ships into battle-ready cruisers, arming them with turbo lasers, deflector shields, and fighter bays, transforming symbols of aquatic grace into war horses of freedom. His insight would prove decisive in future engagements, but even in these formative years, his tactical mind helped shape the growing military structure of the Alliance. The Rebel Alliance grew not in a straight line, but in a spiderweb of loosely connected cells, each with its own command hierarchy and area of operation. This decentralized structure was both a strength and a weakness. Communication was slow, coordination was tenuous, and there was often duplication of effort. But the structure served one critical purpose: resilience. If one cell was destroyed, the others would endure. These cells operated under code names Phoenix Cell, Massassi Group, Fulcrum Network, and were scattered across the galaxy. The Phoenix Cell, under the command of Commander Jun Sato, and later incorporating the crew of the Ghost under Hera Syndulla, became one of the earliest functional naval units capable of staging multi-ship operations. The Massassi Group, hidden within the ancient temples of Yavin 4, would become a crucible for many of the Alliance's later victories, harboring ships and personnel before the Battle of Yavin changed galactic history. These cells, operating on the edge of detection, specialized in raids, sabotage, and convoy harassment. The early missions were modest in scope but vital in impact, stealing fuel from Imperial depots, intercepting supply lines, and rescuing defectors or political prisoners. One such operation, a joint effort between Phoenix Cell and the Fulcrum agent Ahsoka Tano, successfully liberated a convoy of prisoners bound for an Imperial labor facility on Naraka. Another mission saw the theft of a vital hyperdrive core from a shipyard above Lothal, denying the Empire a key piece of infrastructure and crippling an entire production line for weeks. Each success was marginal in scale but amplified in effect, echoing across the HoloNet as propaganda victories and rallying calls for new recruits. The fleet's commanders knew from the outset that they could not afford attrition. The loss of a single frigate could cripple operations across an entire sector. Thus, hit-and-run tactics became doctrine. Ships emerged from hyperspace only long enough to deliver a strike, then vanished before the Empire could deploy a counterattack. Astromech droids were programmed with dozens of fallback coordinates. Crews trained for rapid hyperspace jumps. Some cells even used ion trails and decoy transmissions to mislead Imperial pursuit, allowing the real fleet to slip away unseen. In many cases, what looked like a scattered retreat was in fact a pre-planned maneuver designed to lure pursuing Imperial ships into ambushes or minefields. This emphasis on mobility led to the development of mobile command bases, freighters converted into signal hubs, hollowed-out asteroids equipped with shield generators, even disused separatist factories on backwater worlds like Attalon and Ryloth. These became safe harbors, refit stations, and command nodes. Perhaps the most famous of these was Chopper Base on Attalon, where Phoenix Cell coordinated multiple strikes before the Imperial counterattack led by Grand Admiral Thrawn. That confrontation, though costly, taught the rebel leadership harsh lessons about the limits of secrecy and the price of underestimating the Empire's strategic capabilities. The strength of the rebel fleet did not come from tonnage or firepower, but from its people. Pilots, engineers, smugglers, defectors, and freedom fighters, all of them contributed to the fleet's survival and success. The fleet was built not only in the hidden shipyards of Mon Cala or the secret hangars beneath icy ridges on Hoth, but in the stolen hours of Night Watch technicians welding cannon mounts, in the last-minute hyperdrive fixes from grease-stained droid techs, in the tense silences before another blockade run. Every ship told a story, and every crew bore the weight of entire star systems hoping for freedom. In time, the Rebel Alliance would grow bold enough to gather its forces for major engagements: Yavin, Hoth, Endor. But those moments rested on a foundation of years spent surviving with nothing but grit, cunning, and a will to resist. The Rebel fleet, for all its patchwork origin and chaotic birth, would become one of the most effective fighting forces in galactic history. But before it was the hammer that shattered the Empire, it was the whisper in the void, the spark in the dark. Chapter 2: X-Wing, the Spearhead of Freedom. Among the myriad ships that dotted the void during the Galactic Civil War, none would become more iconic or more feared by Imperial commanders than the T-65B X-Wing Starfighter. Sleek, reliable, deadly, and versatile, the X-Wing was far more than a piece of technology. It was a symbol, a banner of rebellion streaking across the stars, defying the cold efficiency of Imperial order with every proton torpedo launched and every wing filed into attack position. Its creation was a miracle of circumstance and risk, a tale of courage not only in battle, but in design rooms and engineering bays. The story of the X-Wing began with Incom Corporation, Once a respected shipwright and supplier for the Galactic Republic, Incom's engineers had long worked in the shadow of the great Kuat drive yards and CNR fleet systems, but their design philosophy favored modularity, pilot survivability, and long-term versatility over the sheer mass production that would later define Imperial doctrine. With the rise of the Empire, Incom's T-65 project became a contentious point. Ordered to scrap the design in favor of mass-producing TIE variants, a group of sympathetic engineers defected. In a daring operation orchestrated with the help of rebel intelligence, the prototype schematics and several functional models were smuggled out and delivered to the Rebel Alliance. From that moment on, the rebellion had a game-changer in its arsenal. Unlike the Imperial TIE Fighter, cheap, fast, but woefully unarmored, the X-Wing represented a different design ethos. It was a multi-role starfighter, equally capable of engaging in dogfights, intercepting larger vessels, and performing light bombing runs. Its spoils, which expanded into the signature X formation during combat, provided greater stability for its 4 laser cannons. Its deflector shields, hyperdrive system, and astromech-assisted targeting gave it unmatched survivability and operational range. The T-65B, the most commonly fielded model during the early days of the war, became the standard against which all rebel pilots were measured. Its capacity to carry proton torpedoes gave it punch enough to cripple even capital ships, while its agility ensured it could hold its own against entire squadrons of TIEs. What made the X-Wing so effective wasn't just its engineering, it was how it was used. Rebel doctrine leaned into the ship's flexibility, forming elite units that operated independently behind enemy lines or spearheaded major fleet engagements. Red Squadron was one of the earliest of these groups, formed from veterans and flight leaders drawn from various cells. Their coordination, courage, and sheer tenacity made them a vital force at the Battle of Yavin, where it was their torpedoes, guided by skill, instinct, and in one case the Force, that found the exhaust port and destroyed the Death Star. The loss of so many of Red Squadron's pilots that day became a somber legacy, but their sacrifice elevated the squadron into legend. The survivors, including Wedge Antilles, would go on to form the nucleus of something even greater. Rogue's Squadron was born in the aftermath of Yavin, conceptualized by Commander Antilles and Luke Skywalker as a strike force of elite pilots able to operate with near autonomy. Rogues were not just skilled flyers, they were tacticians, saboteurs, and sometimes spies. Operating out of hidden bases and often under the nose of the Empire, they launched precision strikes on supply depots, communications relays, and convoys that disrupted entire camps. During the evacuation of Hoth, it was Rogue Squadron that bought time for the retreating transports, braving overwhelming odds in both X-Wings and snowspeeders. Later, in the campaigns leading up to Endor, they were instrumental in locating and dismantling the various shield generator installations that defended Imperial positions. Their adaptability, born from the very versatility of the X-Wing itself, allowed them to perform missions other craft would not survive. In the shadows of Rogue Squadron flew the Wraiths. Wraith Squadron, an off-the-books unit formed under the command of Wedge Antilles during the post-Endor campaigns. The Wraiths were something new, pilots who could fight in space and infiltrate on the ground. Equal parts commando and pilot, they took full advantage of the X-Wing's ability to operate in isolated conditions. While never as famous as the Rogues, the Wraiths carried out some of the most daring and unconventional missions of the war, including sabotage operations on Imperial-aligned warlords and intelligence recoveries that shifted entire campaigns. The fact that they flew the same class of Starfighter spoke to the platform's incredible range and reliability. The X-Wing was no longer just a ship. It was an extension of the pilot's will. Among those pilots were individuals whose names would be remembered long after the war. Wedge Antilles, the only known pilot to survive both Death Star battles, became synonymous with the rebellion's courage. His leadership of Rogue Squadron and later his role in shaping the New Republic Defense Force made him one of the most respected tacticians in the galaxy. Tycho Selchu, an Alderaanian who survived the destruction of his homeworld, brought a cold fire to every engagement he entered, fighting not just with skill but with the weight of personal loss. Though once suspected of betrayal during the Tycho conspiracy, his loyalty was never truly in doubt, and he would later serve as a key commander in the post-war years. Coran Horn, a Karelian pilot and former Corsair officer, joined Rogue Squadron during the New Republic's campaign against Izan Izard and brought with him both investigative acumen and latent force sensitivity. Though initially unaware of his Jedi heritage, Horn would go on to play a significant role in the new Jedi Order, but it was in the cockpit of his X-Wing that he made his first mark, taking down warlords, infiltrating planetary defenses, and outmaneuvering aces in one-on-one dogfights. The impact of the X-Wing on pivotal battles cannot be overstated. At Yavin, it was the X-Wing's torpedo systems, guided by astromech data and the intuition of the Force, that destroyed the first Death Star. At Endor, X-Wings played a crucial role in the space battle above the Forest Moon, engaging the Imperial fleet and buying time for Han Solo's strike team to disable the shield generator. Though the Millennium Falcon would fire the killing shot into the second Death Star's core, it was escorted through the battle's maelstrom by X-Wings, shielding it from the deadly arcs of Imperial turbolasers and TIE swarms. Even in lesser-known engagements, such as the Battle of Boreleus, a staging ground during the Thrawn campaign, the X-Wings proved decisive. There, under Wedge Antilles' command, they conducted atmospheric dogfights against TIE interceptors, while supporting ground forces, demonstrating once again the ship's unmatched versatility. The expanded universe expanded the legacy of the X-Wing far beyond the Galactic Civil War. With the rise of the New Republic and later the Galactic Alliance, the T-65 platform was continuously upgraded, improved, and repurposed for new threats. Among the most advanced iterations was the Stealth XA, black, sensor-dampened variant built for Jedi use. These starfighters featured minimal sensor profiles, advanced cloaking tech, and reinforced hulls capable of resisting even the edge of a turbo laser blast. Pilots like Jaqen Solo and Jaina Solo flew Stealth X fighters during the Yuuzhan Vong War, the Dark Nest Crisis, and the Second Galactic Civil War, using their unique force-attuned senses to guide their craft through conditions that would have overwhelmed even the best computer-aided system. In the hands of Jedi pilots, the X-Wing became more than a war machine, it became a blade of the Force itself. Despite technological advances and the passage of decades, the core principles of the X-Wing design endured. No other ship balanced firepower, speed, resilience, and pilot survivability so well. No other fighter was so thoroughly woven into the narrative of resistance, freedom, and sacrifice. It was the craft of choice for heroes, the ship that allowed a farm boy from Tatooine to become the last hope of a dying Jedi Order. It was the fighter that carried Wedge Antilles into glory and brought unknown pilots into the annals of history. In every hangar bay, the familiar shape of the X-Wing's closed cockpit dark seemed to wait for another battle, another cause, another pilot who dared to defy the odds. The Empire had numbers, the Empire had dreadnoughts, but the Rebellion had the X-Wing, and in the end that made all the difference. Chapter 3. Y-Wing. The Workhorse Bomber. In the silhouette of war, where sleek interceptors and cutting-edge starfighters often capture the glory, there exists another shape, clunkier, battle-worn, and unmistakably reliable. The Coenzia BTLA-A4 Y-Wing, nicknamed by many rebel pilots as the Wishbone, or simply the Brick, stood as the backbone of countless missions that won the war not through elegance, but through sheer perseverance and firepower. Built originally as a multi-purpose bomber and attack craft for the Galactic Republic during the Clone Wars, the Y-Wing carried with it a legacy of combat endurance, outlasting several newer designs and finding itself pressed into service by a rebel alliance in desperate need of capable, if outdated, hardware. Though it lacked the visual appeal or speed of later starfighters like the X-Wing or A-Wing, its staying power was undeniable, both in literal hull integrity and in its enduring role throughout the most pivotal battles of galactic history. Koenza Manufacturing designed the Y-Wing with durability in mind. The BTLA-4 model was the standard single-seat variant adopted by the Rebellion, evolving from the earlier two-seat BTLB version used by Republic forces. The design philosophy was simple: make a bomber that could deliver heavy payloads under fire and get back home. Its twin-ion engines provided steady thrust, and while it lacked maneuverability compared to a TIE fighter or A-wing, it made up for that deficit with armored shielding, dual-ion cannons, laser turrets, and the capacity to carry an impressive payload of proton bombs and torpedoes. If the Y-wing's reputation for reliability was such that Rebel maintenance crews often joked that it would still fly even if half the ship was bolted together with scrap and hope. Over time, the Y-wing's outer hull plating was stripped away by Alliance mechanics in order to reduce weight and make field repairs easier, lending the craft a skeletal, stripped-down appearance that only added to its mythos. Beneath its exposed conduits and patchwork frame beat the heart of a weapon that had outlived the Republic, survived the Empire, and helped forge the new Republic in fire. The Y-wing's combat history stretched far beyond its years in the Alliance. During the Clone Wars, squadrons of Y-wings flew alongside Jedi generals and clone pilots in engagements across the galaxy, from the skies of Umbara to the sieges of Outer Rim strongholds. Its ability to disable enemy shields and deliver precision bombing runs made it a favorite in large fleet operations, particularly when heavier gunships were not available. However, following the rise of the Empire, Coinsire's contracts were gutted and the Y-wing fell out of favor in official fleets. TIE bombers, cheaper to produce and easier to crew, became the Empire's preferred tool for planetary strikes and space-based bombings. Many wings were decommissioned, sold off to local defense fleets, or mothballed in Imperial scrapyards, and it was from these scrapyards, surplus dealers and black market sources that the Rebel Alliance quietly began to rebuild a bomber corps from the forgotten relics of the Clone Wars. In the earliest days of the Rebellion, the Y-wing represented one of the few options available for striking hard targets. Modified to suit the needs of hit-and-run assaults, many of the Alliance's Y-wings had their hyperdrives upgraded, weapons systems enhanced, and internal power routing reconfigured to allow for faster target acquisition and firing sequences. These modifications would be tested and proven in missions such as the raid on Lothal, one of the earliest major strikes against Imperial infrastructure. There, Y-wings operated in tandem with Phoenix Cell, flying cover while ghost teams sabotaged supply depots and shipyards. It was during this operation that several pilots reported flying directly into the teeth of an Interdictor cruiser's gravity well projectors. Yet, thanks to the Y-wing's reinforced hull and ion cannon loadout, they were able to disable the vessel long enough for the fleet to escape. That same battle saw the recovery of several additional Y-wings rusting in an Imperial depot, reclaimed by the Rebellion, and flown to freedom with their systems barely functioning. The Y-wing's utility and resilience would shine again in the most daring mission of the early war, the Battle of Scarif. As part of the fleet that assaulted the Imperial security complex guarding the Death Star plans, Y-wing squadrons were tasked with disabling Star Destroyers in orbit, clearing a path for ground teams and preventing Imperial reinforcements from crushing the operation. With surgical precision, they deployed ion torpedoes that disabled the shields of the Persecutor-class destroyers, rendering them vulnerable to the rest of the fleet. It was not a glamorous mission, nor one likely to make HoloNet headlines, but it was essential. Without the Y-wings knocking out those shields, the rest of the strike force would have been annihilated. In fact, many ships that survived Scarif owed their survival to those bombers, though few would ever know the names of the pilots who flew them. That anonymity was emblematic of the Y-wing's legacy, uncelebrated but indispensable. In the early phases of the Galactic Civil War, one of the lesser-known but strategically significant victories was the assault on the Imperial weapons development facility orbiting Despard, shortly before the full deployment of the Death Star. Despard, largely erased from official records, was not only a testing ground for dark science, but also a manufacturing hub for turbo laser calibration arrays. A fleet of Y-wings under the command of Horton Saum and coordinated with Rebel intelligence initiated a daring bombing run through the planet's defense grid. Flying in tight formation through overlapping fields of fire, they targeted power regulators, destabilizing the orbital structure's defenses and causing a chain reaction that crippled production capabilities across the sector. The cost was high, with nearly a third of the attacking force lost in the operation, but the strategic benefit was undeniable. It delayed the full arming of the Death Star's superlaser by weeks, giving the Alliance precious time to prepare. The pilots who flew Y-Wings were a breed apart. Pragmatic, steady, and aware of the risks. They knew they were flying ships that were not the fastest or most glamorous, but they trusted their armor, their teammates, and their instincts. Dutch Vander, leader of Gold Squadron at the Battle of Yavin, was one such pilot. A veteran of numerous campaigns, Vander led his squad into the trench run with a calm focus, understanding that their role was not just to attack, but to draw fire and clear a path. Though he died before the final shot was fired, his sacrifice paved the way for the success of Luke Skywalker's run. Horton Sam, another Y-Wing ace, flew in multiple key battles, including Endor, where his precise targeting and leadership contributed to disabling critical systems aboard the Executor-class Star Dreadnoughts. Then there was Kian Farlander, a name often lost in the cacophony of war stories, but whose personal journey from pilot to Jedi made him one of the most unusual veterans of the rebellion. Farlander flew Y-Wings in some of the earliest campaigns, and later used his sensitivity to the Force to aid in precision targeting during especially difficult bombing runs. His flight logs remain among the most studied in Alliance training academies for their clarity and composure under fire. Beyond the war, the Y-Wing did not simply fade away. While newer fighters, like the E-Wing and K-Wing, entered New Republic service, many planetary defense forces continued to use upgraded Y-Wings well into the next galactic era. Some variants were modified to include improved shield systems, faster hyperdrives, and even cloaking modules for stealth missions. During the Black Fleet crisis and in later skirmishes against Imperial Remnant forces, the Y-Wings served as both a training craft and a frontline bomber when heavier assets were unavailable. Even in the Yuuzhan Vong War, aging Y-Wing frames were pulled from mothballs, retrofitted with modern tech, and thrown back into the crucible of combat. That longevity was not just a testament to Kunsaya's original engineering. It was a tribute to the spirit of those who had kept the galaxy alive when hope seemed impossible. In an age of gleaming ships and faster-than-light warfare, the Y-Wing reminded the galaxy that resilience, not elegance, often determines victory. It was the hammer to the X-Wing's scalpel, the brute that got the job done when there was no margin for error. Time and again, its thick hull and stubborn shields carried its pilots home where others would have been lost. It delivered its payloads even as enemy fire scorched its wings and systems blinked out one by one. It flew in silence, in flame, in defiance. And when the war was finally won, the Y-Wing, scarred, singed but still flying, remained a quiet sentinel in hangars across the galaxy, ready to rise again if called upon. Chapter 4. A-Wing, the lightning striker. If the X-Wing was the balanced sword of the Rebel fleet and the Y-Wing its blunt hammer, then the A-Wing was its dagger, sleek, fast, and devastatingly precise. The RZ-1 A-Wing Interceptor stood as the fastest fighter in the Rebel Alliance arsenal, a ship designed to turn speed into survival and agility into lethality. Where other starfighters were designed to endure fire or dish it out, the A-Wing thrived on the edge of disaster, relying on its pilots' reflexes and its barely contained engines to strike, slip away, and strike again. It was never meant to fight fair. It was meant to outrun, outmaneuver, and outwit its prey. In a galaxy where the Empire ruled the spaceways with sheer numbers, the A-Wing proved that velocity and finesse could be weapons every bit as deadly as brute force. The RZ-1 variant that came to define the A-Wing's role in the Rebel fleet was the product of necessity, ingenuity, and subversion. The design itself had roots stretching back to Republic-era interceptors, but it was the Rebel alliance that truly transformed the ship into the surgical tool it would become. Developed in secret by a cadre of engineers loyal to the cause, many of them defectors from prominent shipwrights like Kutat Systems and Incom, the A-Wing took shape in hidden facilities far from prying Imperial eyes. Chief among these was the research base at Hashimut, where engineers worked under constant threat of discovery, scouring the black markets and old scrapyards for parts, while refining the A-Wing's unique profile. Stripped of unnecessary systems, its hull was lightweight, its power systems overloaded, and its twin Novaldex J-77 Event Horizon engines tuned to extremes that bordered on recklessness. The result was a ship that could match or exceed the speed of any TIE interceptor, pushing the limits of inertial compensation and pilot endurance. The RZ-1 had no astromech socket. It had minimal armor. Shields were modest at best. But it had speed, and in that speed lay its survival. The TIE Wing entered service at a crucial time, just as the Empire began fielding more advanced TIE variants designed to close the performance gap between Imperial and Rebel starfighters. The TIE Interceptor, with its dagger-like wings and brutal maneuverability, posed a growing threat to the Rebellion's hit-and-run doctrine. Standard X-Wings, while versatile, found themselves increasingly outpaced in these engagements, particularly during escort missions or interdiction runs where close-range turning battles were inevitable. The A-Wing was the answer. Its ability to dogfight with the interceptors, then disengage before reinforcements arrived, made it an invaluable addition to Rebel squadrons. Deployed in small numbers, often in pairs or recon flights, A-Wings became the scalpel that preceded the hammer, the first strike, the probing sting, the distraction that paved the way for heavier ordnance to follow. Tactically, the A-Wing was not a frontline fighter in the traditional sense. It was designed for reconnaissance, interception, and hit-and-fade strikes. Its twin laser cannons were supplemented by concussion missile launchers, giving it a surprising amount of firepower for such a small frame. Pilots were trained to rely on speed and initiative, attacking from angles other ships couldn't reach and escaping before enemy sensors could fully lock on. It became the weapon of choice for anti-fighter screen duty, often tasked with sweeping ahead of the main fleet to engage enemy TIE patrols or to intercept fast-moving Imperial shuttles. In fleet actions, A-Wings flanked enemy squadrons, drew fire from bombers, and disrupted enemy formations with terrifying precision. When flown well, a single A-Wing could turn an engagement on its head. When flown poorly, it was vaporized before the pilot knew they were under fire. It was not a ship for the faint of heart. The Battle of Endor marked the A-Wing's coming of age, and within that chaotic, decisive clash hung a moment that would become legend. Arvel Krynid, an A-Wing pilot with Green Squadron, made one of the most impactful sacrifices in the history of the Rebellion. With the Executor, Darth Vader's personal Super Star Destroyer, disabled but still active, Krynid's A-Wing sustained damage in the ongoing battle. Instead of bailing or drifting out of combat, he aimed his failing ship directly at the command bridge. With smoke trailing from his engines and shields gone, he crashed into the Executor's control tower, killing the bridge crew and sending the massive dreadnought careening into the Death Star's surface below. It was an act of pure desperation, but also of clarity. A single pilot in a ship dwarfed 1,000-fold by its target, altering the course of the war through courage and speed. Krynid's name became a rallying cry for future generations of pilots, and his action forever cemented the A-Wing's place as more than just a tool of warfare. It became a symbol of audacity. Beyond Endor, the A-Wing played a critical role in the campaigns against Grand Admiral Thrawn, whose tactical genius required a response as precise and aggressive as he was. Thrawn's deployments often utilized layered defense formations and overwhelming firepower designed to lure and trap. Against such tactics, the A-Wing's speed allowed Rebel commanders to deploy squadrons that could bait the Imperial response, slip behind enemy lines, and strike at coordination nodes or supply vessels. In multiple engagements across the Orinda and Bilbringi campaigns, A-Wings were used to cut off escape routes, intercept fleeing shuttles, and take out sensor arrays before main forces arrived. Their value lay not in eliminating capital ships, but in disrupting the order that those ships relied on. By turning Thrawn's perfectionist structure against him, the A-Wings allowed more conventional forces to strike with lethal precision. Among the elite pilots who made their careers in the cockpit of the RZ-1 was Jake Farrell, a veteran of countless dogfights and one of the few who had survived the early battles with TIE interceptors during the formative years of the Rebellion. Farrell's flying was marked by fluid motion and near-intuitive dodging, a quality that earned him a seat on several training rosters post-war. His insights helped shape A-Wing doctrine for years to come. Another pilot drawn from the expanded universe was Sile Antilles, known under her call sign Windsor Starflare, in her previous life as a holodrama actress. The sister of famed pilot Wedge Antilles, Sile joined New Republic intelligence and operated under deep cover for many years. She flew A-Wings during several high-risk missions, including planetary insertions, covert reconnaissance in the deep core, and interdiction raids on Black Sun convoys. Her ability to fly undetected and extract high-value intelligence made her one of the most successful covert operatives of the early New Republic. For all its speed and deadliness, the A-Wing was also a ship that demanded the utmost from its pilots. The sheer acceleration placed intense strain on their bodies. Many reported blackouts or tunnel vision during extended maneuvers. Inertial compensators could only offset so much, and in the RZ-1 there was often no second chance. Pilots were trained rigorously in flight simulators tuned to mimic the ship's handling, and only those with exceptional reflexes and nerve were selected for frontline duty. The A-Wing squadrons became almost mythic within the fleet, daring, reckless, and often eccentric. They wore their own colors, painted kill counts on the noses of their ships, and developed reputations as lone wolves, often operating ahead of the main fleet or diving into the most dangerous parts of an engagement without hesitation. Their casualty rate was higher than average, but so was their kill ratio. Despite being difficult to maintain and prone to catastrophic failure if damaged in the wrong subsystem, the A-Wing endured through the Rebellion and well into the New Republic. It was upgraded, re-engineered, and eventually replaced in most theaters by the faster RZ-2 and the more versatile E-Wing. But even then, the A-Wing lingered. Planetary defense forces continued to use refurbished units, while rogue factions and privateers retrofitted them with advanced tech and illicit weapons. Role shifted from frontline interceptor to specialist craft, used for border patrol, courier work, and high-speed diplomacy. Some A-Wings with upgraded stealth systems were even employed during the Yuuzhan Vong War, carrying out fast strikes against organic fleets that had no counter to their incredible speed. In every era, when the galaxy required a fighter that could move like thought and strike like lightning, the A-Wing answered the call. It was a ship for the bold, for the sharp-owned, for those who saw the line between success and death and chose to fly it anyway. The A-Wing was not built for comfort or prolonged warfare. It was built for speed, precision, and for pilots who understood that some wars are won not by overwhelming the enemy, but by staying one step ahead of them at every turn. Where others would crash, the A-Wing danced. Where others would stall, it accelerated. And when the time came to decide the fate of battles, it was often the flash of its engines, silent, sudden, and swift, that marked the beginning of the end. Chapter 5. B-Wing, the Starfighter with Firepower. In the cold calculus of war, where capital ships cast long shadows and starfighters dance around their gravity wells, there emerged one design that redefined the boundary between small craft and siege weapon. The B-Wing Starfighter, a peculiar and asymmetric creation developed under conditions of secrecy and desperation, became one of the most formidable vessels ever flown by the Rebel Alliance. It was not elegant, it was not fast, it was not easy to fly, but in the hands of a skilled pilot it could deliver more destructive power per second than nearly any other single-pilot starfighter in the galaxy. It could disable or destroy Imperial warships in a fraction of the time it took other starfighters to wear down a single shield generator. It was, in essence, a capital ship killer with a cockpit. And like so many weapons of the rebellion, its story began far from the centers of power. Conceived in the obscurity of the Outer Rim, nurtured by aquatic engineers, and refined in secret while the Empire tightened its grip on the stars. The genesis of the B-Wing lies in the Shantipole Project, a clandestine operation conducted on the remote asteroid base known as Shantipole Station, hidden deep within the Roche asteroid field. Overseen by Admiral Gail Akbar and a team of Mon Calamari and Quarren engineers, the goal of the project was clear: to create a starfighter capable of challenging the Empire's increasingly overwhelming fleet presence, particularly the ubiquitous star destroyers that served as mobile command centers and instruments of fear. Rebel intelligence had shown that existing fighters, even the X-Wing with its versatile weapon loadout, could not meaningfully damage such ships without coordinated fleet support. What the rebellion needed was a vessel that could punch above its weight, strike hard, deliver crippling damage, and escape before the enemy could regroup. The design parameters for this new class of starfighter pushed the limits of conventional engineering. The resulting craft, codenamed the B-Wing for its blade-like profile when in flight configuration, was unlike anything that had come before. The most radical innovation was its gyroscopic cockpit, a spherical pod mounted on a rotating axis that allowed the pilot to maintain a fixed orientation regardless of the ship's movement. This gave the B-Wing unmatched firing stability in three-dimensional space and allowed its fixed weapons to track targets in ways no other starfighter could match. Its armament was staggering: a heavy ion cannon, twin laser cannons, a proton torpedo launcher, and options for carrying additional warheads or ion bombs depending on the mission. In essence, it was a flying weapons platform. To power this arsenal, the B-Wing was equipped with a complex and often temperamental set of power converters and cooling systems, which required extensive maintenance and constant monitoring during combat. The ship's shielding was impressive for a vessel of its size, but its speed and maneuverability suffered under the weight of its payload. It was not a dogfighter, it was a destroyer in miniature, and it required a new kind of pilot to unlock its potential. The Battle of Shantipole itself served as the B-Wing's unintentional proving ground. When the Empire discovered signs of the project and moved to investigate, Akbar and the engineering teams were forced to hastily evacuate, taking several prototype B-Wings with them. Though untested in full combat scenarios, the craft were used to defend the fleeing transports, demonstrating their capacity to inflict severe damage on pursuing TIE fighters and escort ships. Rebel command was impressed, and after refining the initial designs, the B-Wing entered limited production. Its deployment was kept intentionally narrow, fielded by specialized squadrons trained to exploit its strengths while mitigating its weaknesses. It was too complex, too unwieldy, and too expensive to mass-produce like the Y-Wing or X-Wing, but in strategic operations where star destroyers were present, the B-Wing became the weapon of choice. At the Battle of Endor, B-Wing squadrons played a pivotal role in the attack on the Imperial fleet. As the Rebel Armada emerged from hyperspace and was confronted by an entrenched Imperial blockade, the B-Wings dove straight into the thick of battle. Their primary task was to disable star destroyers with ion barrages, targeting shield generators and deflector arrays to expose vulnerable areas to follow-up attacks from Mon Calamari cruisers and Y-Wing bombers. Though many were lost in the initial chaos, those that survived contributed to the destruction of multiple enemy capital ships, including at least one Immobilizer-class interdictor, whose gravity wells had threatened to trap the entire Rebel fleet. The B-Wings at Endor, flying in close, knit formations and operating with incredible coordination, demonstrated for the first time what the platform was truly capable of. Their pilots received little of the glory, overshadowed by the dramatic death of the Emperor and the destruction of the second Death Star, but without them, the Rebel fleet might never have reached the battle station at all. The pilots who mastered the B-Wing were not the glory hounds or aces of other squadrons. They were patient, calculating, and deeply attuned to the rhythms of their ships. Ten Num, the Sulistan weapons expert who flew in Blue Squadron at Endor, became one of the B-Wing's most respected combat veterans. Often mistaken for his compatriot Ni Nun BN-B-10 Num, developed unique approaches to power distribution mid-battle, fine-tuning the balance between weapons output and shield regeneration in real time. Kian Farlander, who had earlier made a name for himself in Y-Wings, transitioned to B-Wing operations and became instrumental in several early deep strike missions against Imperial shipyards. His precision bombing of the Kuat orbital dry docks, conducted under the cover of a meteor storm, crippled production lines that might have turned the tide at Endor. Even Ni Nun, better known for his co-piloting of the Millennium Falcon, logged flight hours in B-Wing variants used during planetary defense operations on Sullus and later Chandrila, demonstrating the craft's flexibility and enduring relevance. The B-Wing's real strength came not from any single engagement, but from its capacity to reshape the tactical landscape of fleet warfare. Star destroyers, once viewed as virtually untouchable without overwhelming numbers, now had to consider the threat posed by a handful of these angular star blades slipping into range. Their ion cannons could render turbolasers inert, and their warhead payloads could breach even reinforced hangar bays or shield projectors. In the right circumstances, a wing of B-Wings could turn a battlefield into a graveyard for capital ships. This capability led to the formation of specialized strike units, most notably Blade Squadron, a unit whose very name evoked the slicing silhouette of the B-Wing in flight. Blade Squadron was formed in the wake of Endor, intended as a rapid response and deep strike asset for the New Republic. Operating from mobile carriers, they specialized in hit-and-run attacks on remnant strongholds and warlord fleets that refused to accept the Empire's defeat. In campaigns across the Corellian sector and later in the Mid-Rim, Blade Squadron performed surgical strikes on shipyards, data relays, and fleet command centers. Their actions at the Battle of Anaxis, where they disabled a Golan 3 orbital platform before a ground invasion, earned them recognition across the New Republic's naval command. Each pilot in Blade Squadron was selected not only for their flying ability, but for their technical acumen. The B-Wing demanded engineers in the cockpit as much as warriors. Maintenance issues, overheat failures, and navigation faults were commonplace, and only those who understood the machine down to its circuits could truly wield it in battle. Even as the New Republic advanced technologically, the B-Wing retained a place of honor within its arsenal. Successive generations introduced upgrades, better shielding, improved cockpit layouts, enhanced fire control systems, but the core design remained largely unchanged. It had been built to do one thing, and that one thing it did better than any ship before or since: destroy larger enemies with surgical precision. In later years, as the galaxy lurched through the Yuuzhan-Vong War and the rise of the Galactic Alliance, B-Wings continued to fly. Some were refitted with plasma warheads to penetrate Vong biocraft. Others were adapted into electronic warfare variants capable of jamming Devan basal manipulations and projecting false signals to scramble enemy tactics. They became the quiet sentinels of resistance, a reminder that brute power could be redirected, refined, and fired from a single cockpit. To fly a B-Wing was to accept a challenge not just from the enemy, but from the ship itself. Its controls were unintuitive, its frame was temperamental. It required an exacting kind of discipline, a pilot who could master chaos and impose order on a ship that wanted to twist out of control. But for those who could harness it, the B-Wing offered something no other starfighter could: the ability to go toe-to-toe with a Star Destroyer and walk away from the wreckage. It was never the face of the rebellion nor the poster child of its victories, but it was its blade, hidden until needed, swift, unyielding, and devastating. Chapter 6: U-Wing and Support Craft. While the starfighters of the Rebel Alliance dazzled with daring dogfights and capital ships clashed in thunderous space engagements, it was the quieter, less heralded vessels that often determined the outcome of the war. Support craft, those unsung, often overlooked lifelines that bridged fleets, delivered soldiers, patched hulls, and slipped agents past enemy lines, formed the vital circulatory system of the rebellion. Among these, the U-Wing stood out as a symbol of multi-purpose ingenuity, embodying the balance of transport, firepower, and adaptability that allowed the Alliance to wage asymmetrical warfare across thousands of systems. But beyond the U-Wing were countless other support ships, refitted freighters, atmospheric shuttles, medevac cruisers, field repair drones, each playing their part not on the Holovid stage of galactic history, but in the shadows where wars are truly won. The U-Wing, formerly designated the UT-60D, was developed by Incom Corporation, the same renegade company that had gifted the Alliance the X-Wing. Unlike its sleeker cousin, the U-Wing was not a space superiority fighter. Instead, it filled a tactical gap between personnel carrier, battlefield gunship, and long-range reconnaissance craft, with its forward-swept sweat foils which could lock into flight or combat positions, and its spacious interior capable of ferrying a squad of commandos or supplies. The U-Wing became a cornerstone of the Alliance's mobile strike capabilities. It was armored enough to survive re-entry and low-orbit combat zones, armed with swivel-mount laser cannons and dorsal gun ports, and fast enough with a capable hyperdrive and shielding suite to extract or deploy troops behind enemy lines. Its versatility made it irreplaceable for missions that demanded rapid insertion, fire support, or reconnaissance in hostile space. Nowhere was the U-Wing's value more evident than in Operation Fracture, the high-risk infiltration mission to extract Imperial defector Galen Erso from the world of Adu. Though ultimately tragic in its outcome, the mission underscored the critical role U-Wings played in bridging the gap between espionage and combat. Cassian Andor's team arrived aboard a U-Wing deep within enemy-controlled airspace, navigating deadly weather conditions and anti-aircraft fire to land on the jagged cliffs of Edu's industrial compound. When the extraction turned into an exfiltration under fire, the U-Wing provided covering fire and atmospheric escape capabilities that saved the lives of several operatives. While Erso himself did not survive, the data he seeded and the willingness of a small group to penetrate Imperial lines to retrieve him changed the course of the war. The U-Wing was not just a vehicle, it was the blade tip of Alliance resolve. Beyond combat insertions, U-Wings were frequently deployed for intelligence gathering and planetary reconnaissance. With modular interior bays that could be equipped with sensor arrays, communication suites, or medical facilities, they became the chameleons of the fleet. On one mission over the ice world of Mykapo, U-Wings operated as AWACS-style relay hubs, scanning for hidden Imperial depots while providing atmospheric overwatch to Resistance ground forces. Their capacity to hover in atmosphere, land on rugged terrain, and quickly transition from stealth mode to aggressive combat posture made them perfect for frontier work where lines blurred between military, humanitarian, and espionage objectives. This versatility also extended to planetary evacuation operations, where U-Wings evacuated political prisoners, wounded soldiers, and even entire village populations under threat of Imperial retaliation. In the desert barrens of Pakrik Minor, a single U-Wing transported over 100 refugees in 12 consecutive trips, while under harassing fire from a local garrison, earning its pilot a rare commendation from Mon Mothma herself. The U-Wing, however, was not alone in serving the logistical heart of the rebellion. The Alliance's support craft fleet was a vast and eclectic collection, born from necessity rather than uniform doctrine. It included everything from medical frigates like the Pelter-class cruisers, retrofit from Clone Wars-era vessels to serve as mobile hospitals, to CR-90 blockade runners modified with interior repair bays and supply holds. Shuttles such as the VCX-100 and Lambda-class, the latter captured or acquired through covert operations, became workhorses for short-range transport and infiltration, their unassuming profiles allowing them to masquerade as civilian or Imperial craft when needed. Repair droids and maintenance ships, many of them repurposed industrial units, followed the fleet from hidden base to hidden base, welding together hull fractures, swapping out scorched engines, and often fabricating parts on the fly with jury-rigged tools and scavenged metal. Perhaps no class of support ship symbolized the Alliance's improvisational genius more than the retrofitted freighter. From Gallifrey Yard's GR-75 transports, repurposed to carry food, munitions, or even Starfighter racks, to bulk haulers loaded with smuggled weapon caches or clandestine mobile bases, these civilian-origin ships were the lifeblood of the Alliance. They lacked armament, speed, and glamour, but they could disappear into trade lanes, dock at neutral stations without raising suspicion, and carry critical cargo through war zones. On the front line, they served as repair stations or makeshift hangars. Behind the lines, they seeded supply caches, transported Mon Calamari construction cells, and even deployed commando squads via modified cargo pods dropped from orbit. It was these ships, unhollowed and uncounted, that made sustained rebellion possible. Support craft also played a crucial role in sabotage operations, commando insertions, and infiltration strikes. The infamous betrayal of Inferno Squad, an elite Imperial team that defected to the rebellion following the destruction of the second Death Star, involved multiple support ships coordinating a high-risk deep space rendezvous and data extraction. The squad's re-entry into Imperial space to sabotage the satellites of Operation Cinder was made possible by the U-Wing Borealis, flying under a false transponder code and equipped with specialized signal dampeners. That one ship, acting alone behind enemy lines, enabled Inferno Squad to broadcast the Cinder protocols to the wider Rebel fleet, allowing the New Republic to prepare planetary defenses and preempt planetary-scale weather catastrophes. Elsewhere, covert U-Wing insertions laid the groundwork for the liberation of Kashyyik's orbital stations and helped coordinate with insurgent Wookiee forces. Other ops saw support ships deploying infiltration droids disguised as cargo handlers, slipping past Imperial starports and gathering intel on garrison strength or planetary shield networks. The expanded universe is rich with stories of support craft performing feats of daring every bit as dramatic as those of Starfighter squadrons. During the liberation of Taris, a Corellian corvette loaded with sensor-disrupting plasma arrays created a temporary blind zone in the atmosphere, allowing drop pods containing rebel commandos to reach the surface undetected. A trio of modified YV-929 freighters, known as the Copper Lancel, played havoc with Imperial communications during the Tomboka blockade, jamming subspace signals and rerouting hyperspace buoys to misdirect reinforcements. On Borleus, a former gas refinery orbiting the planet served as both supply depot and medbay, shuttled back into service by support craft that ran non-stop through contested space. Even the famed Rogue Squadron relied on supply ships disguised as merchant convoys to fuel their extended campaign across the Minos cluster, with technicians working from mobile hangars and recovery crews fishing wrecked ships from the void to salvage whatever they could. In these unsung efforts, the soul of the rebellion is laid bare, not in the sharp clash of star destroyers, but in the quiet endurance of those who hauled supplies, tended wounds, and slipped past enemy patrols in outdated shuttles, patched together with wire and grit. For every X-Wing pilot who made it home, there was a U-Wing gunner who covered their retreat. For every battle won in the stars, there were freighter crews who smuggled the fuel, parts, and data needed to make the victory possible. These were the workhorses of the rebellion, the long-haul heroes who did not crave glory, only the hope of a free galaxy. Chapter 7. Capital Ships of the Rebellion. In the sprawling canvas of galactic war, where massive fleets turned the void into fields of fire and ambition, the Rebel Alliance stood not with equal force, but with deliberate ingenuity. The capital ships of the rebellion were not born from well-funded naval academies or military-industrial juggernauts like Kuwait drive yards or CNR fleet systems. They were the product of defiance, born from uprisings, scavenging, defection, and the careful fusion of necessity with innovation. Each vessel was a tapestry of history, retrofits of former Republic vessels, civilian cruisers transformed into warships, and sometimes even captured enemy ships turned against their former masters. These capital ships were not just tools of war, They were symbols of resistance, floating beacons of a fractured galaxy pulling itself together under a banner of rebellion. No contribution was more pivotal than that of the Mon Calamari people, whose culture, technology, and courage became the backbone of the Alliance fleet. The Mon Cala were a peaceful aquatic species known for their artistry and engineering brilliance, who had once built vast cruisers for exploration, diplomacy, and commercial trade. Their floating cities and shipyards orbited Mon Cala like jewels, a testament to a society that found elegance in symmetry and beauty in function. When the Empire subjugated their world, installing puppet leadership and exploiting their resources, the Mon Cala did not bend quietly. The uprising was swift and coordinated, led by figures such as Gial Akbar, Li Cha, and the Quarren engineer Mina Tills. What followed was not just political resistance, but strategic brilliance. The Mon Cala shipbuilders, in concert with Alliance advisors, converted their massive exploration cruisers into warships almost overnight. These ships, already sturdy and self-sufficient, were retrofitted with shield generators, turbo laser batteries, hangar bays, and targeting systems, transforming floating palaces into frontline capital ships. The MC-80 series emerged from this movement, including the famous Home 1, Akbar's flagship, and the Liberty-class cruisers that spearheaded major assaults. The MC-80 cruisers became synonymous with Rebel fleet command. Unlike Imperial Star Destroyers, which relied on sheer mass, intimidation, and overwhelming fighter complements, Mon Calamari cruisers were designed with defensive survivability and operational independence in mind. They featured advanced deflector shielding, compartmentalized internal systems, and redundant power grids, features that made them incredibly difficult to disable with a single strike. Each Mon Cal cruiser was unique, its aesthetic shaped by the individual artisans and engineers who built it. No two were exactly alike, and this lack of standardization made targeting vulnerable systems incredibly difficult for Imperial fire control officers. In battle, these ships often anchored fleet formations, projecting shield bubbles over smaller escort vessels and serving as mobile command centers. At Endor, Home 1 coordinated the Rebel fleet's movements against the Imperial blockade, its sensor systems and communication arrays relaying data to Starfighter wings and intercepting Imperial transmissions in real time. It was aboard such ships that Mon Mothma and Garm Bel Iblis discussed battle plans and diplomatic strategies, making them not only instruments of war, but crucibles of command. Yet the Alliance's capital fleet was far more diverse than Mon Calamari vessels alone. Scattered across its battle lines were the repurposed hulls of a dozen worlds and 100 causes, each telling its own story of rebellion. CR-90 corvettes, like the iconic Tantive IV, were among the first capital ships fielded by the Alliance. Originally diplomatic and patrol vessels under the Old Republic, these fast-moving modular ships were adapted into blockade runners, sensor platforms, and commando transports. Their narrow profiles and multiple engine arrays made them ideal for hit-and-run tactics. With sufficient retrofitting, a CR-90 could mount heavy turbolasers, point defense systems, and reinforced shielding, making them reliable outriders and picket ships during larger fleet engagements. During the Battle of Scarif, CR-90s provided essential data relays and communication support, even as they were torn apart under sustained fire from Imperial destroyers. Each loss was a tragedy, but each delay they caused bought seconds, and each second brought victory closer. Another mainstay of the Alliance fleet was the Nebulon B escort frigate, a vessel with a curious origin. Originally developed by the Empire for convoy protection and anti-pirate patrols, the Nebulon B was prized for its mid-range firepower and starfighter hangars. Several were captured or defected to the Rebellion, where they were rapidly converted into multi-role platforms, some acting as medical frigates, others as starfighter carriers or command ships. Their distinctive bifurcated design, with a narrow connecting spar between engine and command modules, made them vulnerable to concentrated fire, but their ease of maintenance and flexible interior layouts kept them in service through the war and into the New Republic era. At the Battle of Endor, Nebulon B frigates shielded medical transports and carried wounded pilots back from the front line. At Baccarat, they intercepted Cyru V thrust ships, forming the vanguard of the Alliance's emergency response. Even in the years of peace, Nebulon B continued to serve as embassies, patrol ships, and disaster relief vessels, a legacy that echoed far beyond their days of war. Dotted among the ranks of these mainline ships were rarer but no less important vessels, converted Dreadnought-class heavy cruisers, ancient holdovers from the Clone Wars and even earlier. These lumbering brutes, many pulled from scrap fleets or reactivated from disuse, lacked speed and advanced electronics, but made up for it in sheer durability. Their hulls were thick enough to endure prolonged bombardment, and with sufficient retrofitting, their broadside batteries could be brought up to modern standards. These ships were often used as mobile defense platforms for rebel convoys or deep space listening posts. Some carried hangar bays filled with Y-wings and maintenance drones, serving as long-range strike platforms for raids behind Imperial lines. They weren't fast, and they weren't pretty, but they could anchor a flank or weather a siege, and, sometimes, that was all that mattered. The philosophy of retrofitting and modular design ran deep through every corner of the rebel fleet. With limited resources and no centralized shipyards, the Alliance adopted a philosophy of functional adaptability. A captured Victory-class Star Destroyer might be stripped of its heavy weapons and converted into a carrier. A salvaged Separatist Munificent-class frigate could be reborn as an electronic warfare platform. Power systems, weapons mounts, sensor dishes, and engine cores were swapped between vessels like puzzle pieces in an ever-evolving machine. Rebel engineers working in secrecy and often in substandard conditions became masters of modification. Standardization was a luxury they could not afford. Instead, they embraced versatility, building ships that could do 3 jobs instead of 1. Every retrofit told a story of improvisation, of resilience, and of crews who had to know their vessels down to the last power conduit and cooling line. Fleet engagements were where these capital ships truly proved their worth. At Endor, the Alliance's capital fleet faced its greatest challenge, a full Imperial blockade backed by a functional Death Star. When the trap was sprung and the fleet found itself surrounded, it was the capital ships that held formation, absorbed fire, and created openings for Starfighter assaults. Mon Cal cruisers and Nebulon B frigates weaved through fields of green turbo-laser fire, absorbing blow after blow while coordinating with fighter wings to disable shield generators and gun emplacements. The Liberty, one of the first Mon Cal cruisers to fall, took with it scores of ties and several escort carriers before it was destroyed. At Baccarat, immediately following Endor, rebel capital ships stood alongside Imperial remnants to repel an incursion from the extragalactic Sisruik, their overlapping fields of fire and shield coordination preventing the complete conquest of the planet. At Bilbrigi during Thrawn's campaign, rebel capital ships executed one of the most complex fleet maneuvers in the war's history, using decoy drives and ion surges to mislead Thrawn's blockade and punch a hole through his interdiction net, an act that turned the tide and helped cripple the Grand Admiral's assault momentum. In the expanded universe, other classes of capital ship expanded the rebellion's narrative further. Dauntless-class heavy cruisers, rarely seen but deeply respected, became a mainstay of high-risk campaigns. Armed with extensive point defense systems and thick hull armor, Dauntless-class vessels were frequently used to screen Mon Cal cruisers from bomber strikes and fighter harassment. Their internal compartments could be reconfigured mid-mission, allowing them to shift roles from carrier to command ship as needed. Elsewhere, captured Victory-class Star Destroyers, often stripped of their Imperial markings but retaining their firepower, formed the basis for daring deep strike missions into Imperial territory. These ships, once symbols of oppression, now flew under rebel colors, turning the Empire's own might against it. Crewed by defectors, engineers, and veterans from dozens of worlds, these vessels were not just war machines. They were redemption given form. Capital ships in the Rebel Alliance were more than just strategic assets. They were homes, strongholds, and embassies. They were where young officers learned the harsh realities of war, where supply crews stitched together miracles, where commanders made impossible decisions in the dark between the stars. In their command bridges and medical bays, across their hangar decks and data cores, the rebellion endured, not by outmatching its enemy, but by outlasting it, outthinking it, and turning every scrap of technology into a beacon of hope. They were floating testaments to the truth that courage, when harnessed with ingenuity, could reshape even the mightiest tide. Chapter 8: Fleet Tactics and Commanders. The Rebel Alliance was born out of necessity, not design, and its naval doctrine reflected this truth in every engagement, every withdrawal, and every narrow victory. Unlike the Galactic Empire, whose rigid command structures and resource-rich fleets relied on overwhelming firepower, the rebellion thrived through adaptability, decentralization, and unpredictability. What the Alliance lacked in numbers, shipyards, and planetary resources, it made up for with audacity, coordination, and the brilliance of commanders who understood the asymmetrical nature of their war. Their fleets were not shaped around domination but survival. Their strategies were forged not in academies, but in desperate battles, refugee caravans, and the flickering terminals of hidden bases scattered across the stars. And at the center of it all were leaders who made the impossible possible, commanders who defied annihilation time and again by embracing chaos as a weapon. From its inception, the Rebel command structure was intentionally decentralized. The Alliance's leadership understood that centralizing command would present a singular target for Imperial intelligence and orbital strikes. Instead, it relied on cells, autonomous groups of military and political operators who shared intelligence and goals but functioned independently. These cells, like Phoenix Cell in the Lothal sector or the Masasi Group on Yavin 4, each commanded their own fleets and operated with flexibility, forming the early model of decentralized fleet tactics. These units could harass shipping lanes, raid convoys, liberate garrisons, and fade back into the stars before the Empire could respond. Commanders in the field were given broad discretion, often forming temporary coalitions for larger assaults before dissolving back into their sectors. Though chaotic by traditional military standards, this model proved frustratingly effective against an empire trained to fight conventional wars with overwhelming strength. Within this structure emerged leaders who would become legends. Admiral Jial Akbar, a Mon Calamari tactician and one of the architects of the modern rebel fleet, was perhaps the most recognizable among them. Known for his measured judgment and unshakable resolve, Akbar blended Mon Calamari naval traditions with the guerrilla tactics of the rebellion. His strategies focused on exploiting Imperial rigidity, drawing enemy fleets into traps, forcing them into unfavorable terrain, and fragmenting their command cohesion. His orchestration of the Battle of Endor was a masterclass in adaptability, turning a supposed trap into a devastating rout through careful coordination with starfighter wings and capital ships alike. Akbar's legacy lived not just in the battles he won, but in the culture of precision and discipline he instilled within the fleet. General Jan de Dunne, another early strategist, was instrumental in shaping the Alliance's analytical approach to battle planning. A former Republic officer who defected following the rise of the Empire, de Dunne led the Masasi Group from the Yavin 4 base and developed many of the early battle simulation protocols used to train pilots and commanders. It was under his guidance that the Yavin Strike Force identified the thermal exhaust port vulnerability in the Death Star and planned the trench run that led to its destruction. De Dunne emphasized intelligence, the use of scouts and spies, and the value of understanding the enemy's psychology. His contributions to the doctrine of precise, high-risk surgical strikes set a tone that would be emulated in countless engagements throughout the war. Another unsung but crucial figure was Hiram Drayson, head of the Alliance's covert fleet intelligence. and later a key figure in the New Republic's inner council. Drayson operated in the shadows, overseeing strategic resource distribution, black ops coordination, and deep sector deployment. He pioneered the idea of ghost fleets, unmarked, untraceable flotillas that could operate for months beyond supply lines, staging strikes deep into enemy territory and vanishing before countermeasures could be deployed. His operations during the later stages of the war, particularly against warlord enclaves and hidden imperial fortresses, demonstrated the power of clandestine mobility. Drayson's careful management of fleet logistics, counterintelligence, and black site support kept the Alliance one step ahead in battles where traditional fleet assets would never have been enough. General Vanden Willard, a calm and deliberate commander stationed in the Corellian sector, oversaw one of the most active fleet cells in the mid-war period. Willard's coordination of the evacuation from Yavin 4 following the Death Star's destruction was critical in preserving the command structure of the Alliance. He maintained a stronghold in Sullust and later oversaw the logistics of the Endor campaign alongside Akbar. Though less flamboyant than some of his contemporaries, Willard's mastery of timing, resource deployment, and morale stabilization made him indispensable. His understanding of Imperial patrol patterns allowed him to keep essential supply routes open through dangerous corridors and orchestrate resupply operations that kept multiple rebel sectors active despite blockades. The tactical doctrine of the rebel fleet revolved around mission profiles built on disruption rather than domination. Convoy raids were a core tactic, targeting Imperial supply lines, resource freighters, and fuel depots. Rebel corvettes and fast attack frigates would emerge from hyperspace in carefully chosen choke points, disable transports with ion weapons, and recover cargo before vanishing. These strikes forced the Empire to divert capital ships to escort duties, stretching its forces thin across multiple sectors. Hit-and-run attacks were another staple, especially in early campaigns. Fighters and bombers would harass garrisons, depots, and sensor stations, withdrawing before ground defenses could respond. These operations were rarely about territory, they were about momentum, propaganda, and resource denial. Planetary assaults, while rarer due to the limited resources of the fleet, were meticulously planned and usually aimed at strategic installations. Rather than full invasions, these assaults focused on objectives like shield generators, communication arrays, or factories. The combination of orbital bombardment, rapid troop insertion via U-wings or retrofitted transports, and immediate exfiltration made these attacks short, savage, and highly effective. At times, these missions were coordinated in conjunction with local insurgent movements, allowing the Alliance to vanish back into the void while uprisings sparked chaos in their wake. Coordination between fleet and ground elements was key, and commanders learned to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, sometimes making calls based on real-time recon rather than long-form planning. Battle simulations and coordination efforts were headquartered in various mobile command centers and temporary bases throughout the war, but two notable examples stand out. Haven Base, located in a remote star cluster, was one of the earliest semi-permanent rebel naval installations. It was here that many of the mid-war operations were planned, including fleet routes, sector liberations, and special operations coordination. Pilots and officers rotated through Haven Base to conduct simulation drills and receive strategic briefings based on the latest intelligence. Later, the base at Dankayo became a central fleet command hub, and though eventually compromised, it served as a key node for organizing operations like the expansion of the Corellian Sector Resistance Network and the procurement of defector support from captured Imperial officers. Battle simulations at Dankayo included three-dimensional fleet coordination tests, formation exercises for MC-80 and Nebulon-B combined deployments, and joint task force planning scenarios that would lay the groundwork for later campaigns. The flexibility of Rebel fleet strategy is best illustrated through specific case studies. The campaign for Brental 4, a key transit hub in the core worlds, was one of the boldest fleet-led assaults of the mid-war period. Rather than engaging the planet's defenders directly, rebel commanders deployed a distraction fleet that drew off the primary Imperial reinforcements, while a hidden insertion team disabled the planet's orbital defense grid. Capital ships then emerged from hyperspace and rapidly established air superiority. The operation, while costly, showcased the value of synchronized misdirection and rapid deployment. At Duro, the Alliance coordinated with local droid uprisings and saboteurs to strike at orbital shipyards, using a fleet of disguised transports to deliver demolition teams under the guise of merchant traffic. The success of the Duro campaign severely disrupted Imperial production in the sector and gave the rebellion a critical foothold near the core. The raid on Kamar was a textbook example of deep strike tactics. Kamar, a fortified Imperial outpost used for sensor calibration and fleet relay communication, was believed to be impenetrable due to its proximity to multiple destroyer patrol routes. Alliance intelligence, working under Drazen's guidance, identified a window in the planetary shield rotation cycle. A cloaked task force of corvettes and B-wings used this window to approach undetected, disable the primary relay towers, and extract sensitive data on upcoming Imperial fleet movements. Though several vessels were lost on extraction, the intelligence gained was pivotal in foiling Operation Ashen Mantle, a planned Imperial sweep through the mid-rim that could have devastated the Alliance's central fleet. Kamar proved that precision and timing could deliver results that brute force could not. In the expanded universe, the diversity of rebel strategies across different sectors further demonstrated the adaptability of fleet commanders. In the Elrod sector, small rebel flotillas used nebulae and unstable hyperspace lanes to mask their movements, striking key worlds like Derelin and Gala before vanishing. In the Tabani sector, joint operations with the Machete houses resulted in guerrilla-style naval warfare in densely populated systems, relying on local insurgents to sabotage gravity well generators. The mid-rim sector of Arcanis saw the development of asteroid base fleets, stationary combat platforms built into drifting rock fields that rotated crews and launch schedules, striking targets deep behind Imperial lines with impunity. These were strategies no standard fleet doctrine could have predicted, but they worked because they were born of desperation, creativity, and a refusal to surrender. The Rebel Alliance's fleet was not defined by its tonnage or its firepower. It was defined by its commanders and their ability to see possibility in chaos. Whether it was Akbar's grand tactics, Dodonna's analytical precision, Dracen's ghost operations, or Willard's quiet reliability, each played a role in forging a strategy that bent the arc of war. They fought not for conquest, but for freedom. They held no fixed lines, no guaranteed reinforcements, but they had belief, and in that belief they built a navy that could face down empires. The stars bore witness, and the galaxy remembered. Chapter 9. Heroes of the Cockpit. Beneath the gleaming hulls of Mon Calamari cruisers and the exhaust trails of agile starfighters were the living hearts of the rebellion, its pilots. They were the first into the fire, the last to retreat, and the most often forgotten when the tallies of war were counted. The Starfighter Corps of the Rebel Alliance was more than a branch of military service. It was a crucible of loss, loyalty, and legend, forged in the fierce skies above countless worlds. For every name celebrated in history, a dozen more flew and died in silence, their stories etched only in the memories of their squadmates or the data logs of salvaged droid units. And yet, without them, there would have been no Battle of Yavin, no Hoth evacuation, no final victory at Endor. The cockpit was the rebellion's altar, and its heroes were those who sat in it, with no certainty of return, day after day, year after year. Among those lesser-sung heroes was Shira Bree, a name entangled in complexity. Shira's story began as a skilled pilot, serving in Alliance intelligence, embedded within Rogue Squadron under a veil of secrecy. Her talent in the cockpit was undeniable, reflexes sharp as vibroblades, instinctive tactical judgment, and a fearless approach to zero-atmosphere combat. But her loyalty would be tested when she was revealed to be a double agent planted by Imperial intelligence part of a convoluted psychological operation designed to undermine Luke Skywalker and sow discord within the rebellion. Despite her exposure, the tangled morality of her arc was not so easily dismissed. In later expanded universe lore, she would return as Lumiya, a Force-trained operative seeking her own form of justice. In every version of her story, the skills she displayed in the cockpit, her composure under pressure and fluid battlefield awareness, remained defining traits, reminders of how thin the line between hero and traitor could become in the Rebellion's Shadow War. Flying alongside more well-known figures like Wedge Antilles were men like Wes Jansen and Derek Hobby Clivian, two stalwarts of Rogue Squadron whose courage was matched only by their camaraderie. Jansen, known for his irreverent humor and morale-boosting antics, masked a deeply tactical mind honed in battle after battle. He was a natural wingman, a flyer whose instincts kept him and those around him alive through missions that saw entire squadrons wiped from the starfield. Hobby Clivian, quiet and methodical, was no less legendary. His knack for survival, even when his ships were riddled with plasma scars and on the verge of critical failure, became the stuff of squadron myth. Together they formed a bond that became emblematic of the pilot culture within the Alliance. Gallows humor over pre-sled calf, solemn silence after a funeral, and fierce loyalty that transcended rank or origin. They were not defined by glory, but by grit, by the repeated act of climbing back into a cockpit they knew might become their coffin. The Alliance pilot corps was a melting pot of species, each bringing unique strengths and perspectives. Bothans, with their finely honed senses and clan-based honor codes, served with distinction, often as recon pilots or intelligence liaison flyers. The price they paid during the acquisition of the Death Star II plans was immense, but it did not deter them from continuing to fly into danger long after the war turned in the Alliance's favor. Euros, among the galaxy's oldest and most intuitive spacefarers, brought with them generations of experience. Their smooth reflexes and deep connection to sublight and hyperspace navigation made them ideal for dangerous patrol and pursuit assignments. Mon Calamari pilots, although more famous for their roles as naval officers, also took to starfighters, especially in defense of their homeworld. Their natural three-dimensional spatial awareness, developed in oceanic environments, gave them a unique advantage in dogfighting and complex flight maneuvers. The Rebellion was not a human-centric force. It was a mosaic of the galaxy's oppressed aliens and outcasts, whose skills were judged not by species, but by their willingness to fight for freedom. Some pilots rose beyond the cockpit to become leaders whose influence reshaped entire campaigns. Hera Syndulla, once captain of the Ghost and leader of the Spectres, transitioned into a general whose experience bridged the gap between the early cells of rebellion and the formal structure of the Alliance. Hera flew everything, from stolen Imperial transports to advanced prototype fighters, and her ability to read the battlefield from both the cockpit and the war table made her indispensable. Her leadership during the liberation of Lothal and later at Endor and beyond exemplified how a pilot's intuition could scale into strategic brilliance. Another standout was Gavin Darklighter, cousin to Biggs, and once the youngest member of Rogue Squadron. Gavin matured into a capable leader in the New Republic era, commanding Rogue Squadron in campaigns such as the retaking of Coruscant and the Back to War. His tactical creativity, combined with a deep respect for the lives under his command, made him a respected figure across multiple generations of pilots. The Rebellion also relied heavily on those who came from less orthodox backgrounds, defectors, smugglers, and rogues, who had once flown for coin, not cause. Booster Terrick, a former smuggler with a grudge against the Empire, lent not only his considerable flight skills, but his vast knowledge of underworld logistics. His heavily modified freighter, the Errant Venture, would become a mobile command center and supply depot in the New Republic, complete with starfighter bays and encrypted communications. Terrick was not a standard military man, but his loyalty to the pilots who earned his respect, especially Wedge Antilles and his own daughter Mirax, made him a pillar of the informal support networks that kept rebel squadrons operational long after the credits dried up. Bria Tharan, another notable figure, began her journey as a freedom fighter in the Corellian underground. Though her role was cut short in the early phases of the war, her participation in the infiltration of Imperial facilities and data smuggling paved the way for operations like the theft of the Death Star plans. Her death, orchestrated in a betrayal by Imperial forces during the siege of Tuprawa, left a scar across the Alliance, but her name lived on in the encrypted channels of the fleet's underground communication web. Life as a pilot in the Rebel Alliance was not just combat, it was emotional endurance. The psychological toll of constant war, of losing wingmates with every mission, and of knowing that each scramble alert might be the last, weighed heavily on even the best. PTSD was widespread, though rarely discussed in open forums. Pilots dealt with grief in private, leaned on their squadmates, or drowned memories in the bars and lounges of hidden bases. Rituals formed organically, leaving a flight suit unwashed after a successful mission, painting kill markers in cryptic glyphs only squadron members understood, reciting the last transmissions of fallen comrades before takeoff. Camaraderie was survival, and within the cockpit, the pilot's call sign became their second skin. Call signs were more than identifiers. They were legacy, nickname, badge of honor, and sometimes shield against fear. Some were inherited from mentors, others earned through daring maneuvers or spectacular crashes walked away from. Names like Shadow, Nova, Turn, or Splice echoed across briefings, sometimes jokingly, sometimes reverently, always with weight. They were spoken in place of real names when grief made formality too painful. In the years that followed the Galactic Civil War, the legacy of Rebel pilots echoed into the new Jedi Order era. The Starfighter Corps evolved, and with it came a new wave of aces, many of whom had grown up listening to the stories of Endor and Yavin as children. Jagged Fell, of Imperial lineage but trained by New Republic standards, became one of the finest pilots of his generation. Jaina Solo, daughter of Leia Organa and Han Solo, combined force sensitivity with mechanical brilliance, making her a deadly force in the cockpit. Her role in the Yuuzhan Vong War, particularly during the Battle of Ebak 9 and the destruction of enemy world ships, showcased the fusion of old Alliance daring with new Jedi instincts. Other aces, like Kip Duran and Zek, walked the line between Force user and Starfighter ace, pushing their ships to limits beyond what standard pilots could imagine. Even in that future, the bloodline of rebellion flew on, manifested in ships that still bore the markings of old squadrons, and in pilots who learned to fight not just with weapons, but with memory. The heroes of the cockpit were not defined by their ships, their kill counts, or their decorations. They were defined by resolve. They were the pilots who flew into a swarm of ties because someone had to. They were the ones who knew the sound of a dying friend's voice over comms and still climbed back into the cockpit the next day. They were the ones who kept flying, not because they believed they'd win, but because they knew surrender meant the galaxy would never have the chance. They fought for their families, their planets, their fallen comrades, and sometimes for nothing more than the hope that someone else wouldn't have to. Their ships may have burned, their names may have faded, but in every generation that rose to take the mantle of freedom, the spirit of those pilots lived on. In the roar of engines, the flicker of blaster fire, and the silence between stars. Chapter 10. Legacy of the Rebel Fleet. When the second Death Star exploded in the skies above Endor, casting its flaming debris across the stars and dragging the Empire's iron grip into the void with it, there was no single chorus of victory among the Rebel fleet. There was elation, yes, cheers through garbled comms, tears on scorched flight decks, embraces among crew who had braced for death and lived. But behind every celebration was a quiet realization: the war was not over. The Empire would not fall in a single battle, no matter how grand. What Endor signified was something more profound than tactical victory. It was proof. Proof that tyranny could be broken, that superweapons could be shattered, that courage and coordination, when held together by sacrifice, could change the tide of history. And it was the rebel fleet in all its ragtag resilience and decentralized strength that had delivered that blow. The fleet would not dissolve in the aftermath, it would evolve. The ashes of the rebellion would become the forge of a new republic, and with it, a new kind of navy would rise. One that bore the markings, lessons, and scars of the fighters who had given everything to make it real. In the wake of Endor, the Rebel Alliance moved swiftly to consolidate its political and military gains. The fleet, long scattered across the galaxy in hidden bases and ad hoc strike groups, began to gather with renewed purpose. Surviving capital ships were repaired and standardized. Starfighter squadrons were reorganized into formal units under unified commands. With Mon Mothma's declaration of a new republic, the fleet became the military backbone of the new government, transforming from a resistance movement into an institutional force. The New Republic Navy emerged not from scratch, but from the memory and personnel of the rebellion's final campaigns. It carried forward the Mon Calamari cruisers that had shielded fighters at Endor, the Nebulon B frigates that had ferried the wounded from Yavin to Hoth, the CR-90 corvettes that had run blockades across the core. Ships were recommissioned under new flags, but they kept their call signs, their wear, and often their crews. The ghosts of the Alliance were embedded in every circuit and hull panel. In the years that followed, the fleet played a decisive role in stamping out the embers of the shattered empire. At Jakku, the final and most decisive fleet engagement of the Galactic Civil War, the New Republic Navy faced off against the remnants of the Imperial Navy in a battle that spanned the surface and orbit of the desert world. It was a war of attrition, positioning, and sheer willpower. The fleet, now under the joint leadership of generals and admirals who had earned their ranks through fire, Akbar, Willett, and others, matched the Imperial fleet ship for ship. It was not a perfect battle. Losses were high. Star Hawk-class battleships built from salvaged Star Destroyers clashed with Imperial destroyers in cataclysmic duels. Gravity wells failed, engine cores ruptured. But the New Republic held. They pushed the Empire to the breaking point until Sloane and her fleet surrendered or scattered into the unknown regions. Jakku was not just a battle. It was closure, the moment when the legacy of the rebellion became the foundation of legitimate galactic power. Beyond Jakku, the fleet remained vital in quelling rogue Moffs, pirate confederations, and would-be warlords. At Nissof, during the rise of the Yevethan threat in the Kornuk cluster, the fleet was tested by a new kind of enemy: fanatical, isolationist, and cunning. The Yevetha had captured Imperial ships and used them against the New Republic. It was a brutal campaign that saw capital ship engagements more brutal than anything the rebellion had faced, and yet the fleet, tempered by years of asymmetric warfare, adapted. Using precision strikes, feints, and diplomacy, paired with naval power, the New Republic brought peace to the sector. Barely, and not without cost. These post-Endor operations hardened the fleet into a proper navy, but they never stripped it of its soul. Former rebel pilots still flew its squadrons, former smugglers captained its freighters. The spirit of resistance remained, shaped by experience but unbroken in principle. As peace gradually took hold, the fleet underwent structural and doctrinal changes. New classes of ships were designed: Starhawks, Majestic-class heavy cruisers, Defender-class assault carriers, all combining the lessons of the Galactic Civil War with forward-looking defense strategies. Training academies opened across core worlds. The old modularity of the rebellion gave way to standardized task forces, interlinked command chains, and formal logistics networks, and yet vestiges of the rebellion remained. Battle groups were still given old rebel names: Home One Command, Blade Group, Rogue Wing. Starfighter squadrons carried with them decades of inherited tactics, call signs, and camaraderie. The fleet became a mirror of the Republic itself, aspirational, idealistic, occasionally flawed, but always striving to reflect the freedom it fought to protect. In the Legends continuity, the fleet's evolution took even more dramatic turns. With the invasion of the Yuuzhan, a brutal extragalactic species whose bioorganic technology defied all known military logic, the Galactic Alliance was forced to reforge its navy into a weapon capable of surviving extinction. Starfighters and capital ships that had once been enough to hold the line against star destroyers now found themselves ineffectual against world ships, plasma-spitting coral skippers, and black hole-projecting war beasts. The fleet adapted once again. Jedi pilots joined the ranks, flying advanced variants of stealth-capable fighters like the Stealth X. Warships were modified with gravitic warheads, interdiction shielding, and enhanced command algorithms. The core doctrines of hit-and-run, decentralized strike groups, and cross-species cooperation returned in full force. Many of the fleet's most successful commanders were veterans of the rebellion: Gavin Darklighter, Kerfe of Botawai, Traest Vornskran, each carrying forward the instincts born in the cockpit of rebellion. It was a different war, a different enemy, but the spirit remained unchanged. Fight for those who cannot, strike where the enemy is weakest, and never let tyranny define the stars. In time, as peace proved to be a mirage and the galaxy spiraled once more into division, the resistance rose from the ashes of the New Republic, a small force, underfunded, undermanned, but led by figures who remembered what the rebel fleet had been. General Leia Organa, once a diplomat and fighter, now led the resistance, knowing full well that history does not repeat, it rhymes. The ships she assembled were modest. Old Mon Calamari vessels pulled from scrapyards, X-wings without spare parts, pilots trained not in military academies but in the simulators of belief. But those ships, those fighters, flew with the heart of the fleet that had once shattered a Death Star. Poe Dameron, the Resistance's finest pilot, embodied the daring and recklessness that had once defined Rogue Squadron. His maneuvers over Starkiller Base and Crate echoed the flying of Wedge Antilles and Luke Skywalker, and his leadership inspired a new generation to believe that one starfighter could still change the course of war. The Resistance's survival was not due to numbers or technology, but to heritage. The blue and red stripes painted on their wings were more than aesthetics. They were lineage, declarations of loyalty to a cause that transcended generations. The rebel fleet had passed into myth, but its reality persisted. In every hyperdrive trail that disappeared into uncharted systems carrying word of freedom, when the Raddus stood alone against the First Order's armada, when the fighters of Black Squadron dove into impossibly narrow canyons, when the desperate voice of Organa called across the galaxy at Crate, it was the rebel fleet's echo that answered. And so, in the quiet between wars, the legacy endures. It lives in training manuals and old hangar walls scrawled with forgotten names. It breathes in the old ships patched together in distant dry docks. It echoes in the flight traditions passed from pilot to pilot, in the way squadron leaders clip their hair after a lost wingmate, in the way green recruits still look to the stars and believe. The rebel fleet was never about perfection. It was about defiance. It was about believing that speed and steel meant nothing without purpose, and that unity, no matter how fractured, could become a blade sharp enough to cut down an empire. The ships may rest now, scattered in museums, converted into freighters, or drifting as memorials, but the legacy flies on. In every resistance, in every rebellion, wherever a sentient life looks into the void and whispers, "Not again." The rebel fleet was a force of war, yes, but it was also a force of hope, of sacrifice, of unyielding courage bound together not by protocol, but by cause. That legacy cannot be destroyed.